Siege warfare is among the most deadly forms of combat, but not even all sieges are created equal. If you think about some of history's most brutal sieges, such as Leningrad, Stalingrad, or even the siege of Sarajevo, it's clear that it wasn't the Romans who were best at this type of warfare. In fact, these sieges dwarf anything the Romans ever tried. But that doesn't mean the Romans didn't know what they were doing during a siege. The key to winning any siege is exploiting the strengths of your army while minimizing its weaknesses. And Rome was great at that. But that being said, there were still some serious downsides to Roman siegecraft. And had you been a legionary tasked with performing these, you'd probably break under the strain. So here are 5 reasons why Roman siege warfare would break most of us. During the Republic period, Rome didn't really have a standing army like we think of today, but rather a system of military obligation, where able-bodied citizens would be called up for service and discharged after the campaign was over. This meant that when peacetime came around, soldiers would leave the army and go back to their farms. But during siege warfare, there was no peacetime. The whole point of besieging a city is to force the inhabitants to surrender by cutting off their food supply. And in order to do that, you need to keep the people inside the city trapped for a long time. That meant months or even years of continuous campaigning with no real end in sight. A soldier's ability to endure this kind of monotony can be a major factor in determining the outcome of a siege. And the Roman solution was to make sure their soldiers wouldn't be bored out of their minds. Instead, they'd simply be driven insane. Because if you don't die from starvation, exposure, or disease, you might just kill yourself. So imagine you're a Roman soldier on campaign. You left your farm in the spring with the rest of your fellow citizens to help out with the war effort. Your commander tells you that this siege should only last a few weeks at most. And so you set up camp outside the city walls, ready to lay siege. The first few days pass without incident. You mock the defenders as they retreat behind their walls, pelting them with stones and arrows. And then you start to get bored. For 3 weeks, you just sit outside the wall. Nothing happens. You kill a few stragglers who try to sneak out, but no pitched battles take place. Then tensions rise as scouts report enemy reinforcements arriving at the city. Your commander makes it clear that this siege will now go on longer than expected, but he still says not to worry. Victory is close. Another month passes, then another. Winter approaches, and the men begin to grow beards. Morale plummets as the cold sets in, and the men begin dying from exposure. Some go mad, huddling in the fetal position and babbling incoherently. Others become violent, picking fights with anyone who will listen. Your farm back home is now buried under a blanket of snow. You haven't seen your family in what feels like an eternity, and your commander has just told you that the siege will drag on for yet another month. What do? Perhaps you join the others in fighting the imaginary enemy in the forest, or maybe you decide to steal a goat from one of the supply wagons and sacrifice it to the gods. You're not quite sure anymore. All you know is that you need to do something, anything to escape this maddening boredom. Finally, the breaking point comes. Someone starts screaming in the night, and when dawn breaks, you find him hanging from a tree, lifeless. Another victim to the siege. Of course, this is a fictional story, but it's based on actual accounts of sieges in the ancient world. The boredom of siege life was something the Romans understood all too well, and they developed ways to keep their troops occupied, from building siege engines to organizing gladiatorial combats. But still, it could never be avoided entirely. This next problem was one the Romans actually did fight against, and it killed many of them: malaria. Malaria is a mosquito-borne infectious disease that causes fever, weakness, and anemia. It's spread by Anopheles mosquitoes, which typically breed in stagnant water. Ancient Rome had plenty of both, especially during the summer months. During the siege, the Romans built elaborate field camps, complete with latrines and garbage dumps, perfect places for mosquitoes to breed. Combine this with the fact that the Romans were constantly on the move, making it difficult to establish permanent homes with proper sanitation, and you have a recipe for disaster. On top of that, the legions were mostly stationed in southern Italy and the Mediterranean, areas which were already known to be malarial. But none of this compares to the true evil of malaria, which is the ability to lie dormant in the body for decades before flaring up again. No wonder Julius Caesar described the inhabitants of the Pontine Marshes as, quote, a sickly and ghosty crew. Building siege engines was a massive undertaking, requiring hundreds of workers, lots of time, and a huge amount of materials. These giant machines were often manned by slaves or prisoners of war who were unpaid for their work and had little incentive to do a good job. Not only that, but the Romans preferred to assault heavily fortified cities with their siege engines instead of going around and digging tunnels under the walls. This made their job even harder. Many siege engines were lost during assaults, either destroyed by enemy defenders or broken down due to overuse. This isn't surprising considering that these machines were often built hastily and with minimal training. Imagine you're a lowly slave forced to work on one of Rome's many siege engines. You've been whipped several times for taking too long on a task or forgetting your assignments. You haven't slept well in days and are constantly hungry. You don't know how to read or write, so you have no idea where you are or what year it is. The only thing keeping you going is the hope that if you work hard enough, maybe, just maybe, you'll win the favor of your Roman captors and earn your freedom. Unfortunately, you're not so lucky and are killed along with the other engine crews during an assault. Well, that's not exactly how it went, because you didn't build the machine in the first place. You were captured 2 years ago during the sack of a village and were forced to march all the way to this camp. Now you're stuck working on this stupid machine that you don't understand. And if it breaks, you'll be the first one punished. Oh, and did I mention that the general's daughter is watching you from atop the wall, laughing at your every move? Yeah, that's gonna be fun. The Romans excelled at siegecraft because they understood the importance of preparation. They knew that a successful siege required careful planning and attention to detail. Before even laying siege to a city, the Romans would carefully scout the area, looking for natural features that could be used to their advantage. They also took into account the city's defenses, such as the height and thickness of its walls, as well as the number and placement of its towers and gates. Once the siege was underway, the Romans continued to gather intelligence on the city's defenses, looking for weak spots or changes in the guard schedule. This information was then used to develop siege plans that maximized the chances of success. However, not everyone was happy with this level of organization. Many people felt that the Romans were taking too long to prepare for the siege and that they should simply attack the city as soon as possible. These people were known as the populares, and they eventually grew so impatient that they took matters into their own hands, leading to the sack of the city. While this may have been a victory for the populares, it was a defeat for Rome as a whole. The sack of the city resulted in widespread destruction and loss of life, not to mention the damage to Rome's reputation as a civilized and orderly society. This ultimately led to the decline of the populares movement and the restoration of order in Rome. So you've survived the boredom, the disease, the danger of siegecraft, and the mob. What's next? Well, how about a front row seat to the horrors of war? When the Romans laid siege to a city, they expected the defenders to fight back. That meant that the legionaries had to deal with things like catapults hurling objects over the walls, arrows flying through the air, and even poisonous gas. Not exactly a pleasant way to spend your vacation. But that's not even the worst part. Sometimes the Romans would storm the city walls and engage in hand-to-hand combat. This meant that the soldiers had to deal with the sight of blood and guts everywhere, not to mention the smell of death. It was a truly horrifying experience that would stay with the soldiers for the rest of their lives. And that was just on a good day. Sometimes the Romans would come across civilians who had been caught in the crossfire. It was a sad but common sight during the siege, and it was something that the soldiers had to deal with in a professional manner. After all, they were Roman soldiers, and the Romans were supposed to be civilized, right? Well, sometimes it wasn't so easy. The soldiers would often feel torn between their duty to their city and their humanity. In the end, though, duty always won out and the soldiers carried on. Despite the horrors they witnessed, they knew that it was all in the name of Rome.